My father was 92 when he died, and it's a wonder that he should have died at all, for he never grew old. His body just shriveled away. His arms grew as thin as a boy's. The skin that covered his old skull seemed tight and very thin, and his cheeks had begun to sink in. The legs that had walked down many deer in the mountains, legs as strong as a mule's, became thin and white, and quivered under the weight of his body. But he was not old. His mind still bloomed. As he had experienced life with a childlike awe at its unfolding, so, too, he anticipated death. He claimed death was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and he was going to be there to see it through. At the last, a creeping sort of weakness sent him to his bed once more. He was having trouble breathing. His heart, he said. His heart trouble had gotten serious some 40 years earlier, in 1954. He had a heart attack while he was out hunting in the Black Hills of Wyoming. Tom found him in the forest and pulled him out of the deep snow and brought him home. After that, he had several other heart attacks, and he dealt with them all in the same way, as if they were a temporary nuisance. There were more health problems, too, and he repeatedly found himself in and out of the hospital. He once went to the Mayo Clinic to have half his ulcerated stomach cut away. He fought cancer. Cancer had attacked his lungs, his prostate, his colon. But he'd beaten all of the operations and exceeded all of the doctor's expectations of how long he could hang on. We had talked about his dying. Was he afraid to die? He was not. "Remember, Jerry," he said just before he died, "when we cry over the dead, we are not crying over them. We are crying over our own loss. Wherever I go, I'll be all right." He seemed comfortable about death. He was ready for it. His business with himself and his children was finished, but his business with May, my stepmother, well, that was unresolved. How does a man leave the woman he's in love with? I arrived at his bedside the morning following his death. May had been with him at the last. He lay in their bedroom with his hands over the top of his covers as if he were sleeping. His face appeared peaceful. May left me with him in the bedroom. "Daddy," I said. No answer. I saw the shape of his mouth. Even in death his mouth was shaped like mine, I thought. And in life sometimes he formed his words like I form mine. "Daddy," I reached over and touched his hand. It was cold. Then I began to cry. I didn't try to fight the tears. People are permitted to cry over their dead fathers. And as he had said, the tears were not for him, but for me. After a while I said, "You were a mighty fine father," and I was glad I had taken the opportunity on many occasions to tell him so. "Were you with him when he died?" I asked May later. "Yes," she said. She had a distant look on her face and that small, sweet smile. I couldn't put the question quite right. "How was it?" I finally asked. "Well," she said, "I came into the bedroom, and he was having a hard time breathing. He was just in terrible labor, and I said, 'Honey, I wish you didn't have to struggle so hard.' And he said, 'Honey, I'd go, except I don't want to leave you alone.' And I sat down beside him," she said, "and I reached over and I took his hand, and I said, 'Honey, you can go.' And he looked up and smiled at me and closed his eyes, and he was gone." 14 is a fragile age for a boy. That evil potion, testosterone, surging unchecked in my veins, caused me to present nearly every classic sign and symptom of psychosis yet recorded. Reason had abandoned me. Without provocation, I found myself quarreling with authority, any authority, my father, my mother, my teachers. I began to suffer delusions of my perfect wisdom. My parents, once near deities to me, suddenly turned into strangers. In the developing throes of adolescence, I became obsessed with weird, nonsensical music, and I perfected the barbaric dance known as the jitterbug. Ask any father, any mother. If they speak to you forthrightly out of their dismay and grief, they will admit it. Their adolescent sons are, plainly put, quite simply deranged. That hormone, testosterone, is to blame. Indeed, the human male, his blood laced with testosterone, is the most dangerous of all creatures occupying the space on earth. That loathsome hormone is responsible for most murders, most child and spousal abuse, most wars, and most of the other misery inflicted upon the earth and her inhabitants. If we could drain testosterone from the blood, the brain would suddenly clear. Logic would reemerge, the eyes of killers would soften, and kindness and wisdom would prevail. In the waning days of that summer, I became the new kid at Laramie High School. I wish I could have understood the viciousness of the chemical that hurled me so wild-eyed and so ruthlessly psychotic into puberty. I grieve that I was blinded to the beauty of those two loving, blameless people who were helplessly lost in dealing with this teenaged maniac they had spawned, and for me to rediscover who I was would thereafter occupy the better part of my life to follow. Under the consuming influence of testosterone, I began to see my parents as simple, bothersome old fogies whose old-fashioned rules were disgustingly irrelevant to the likes of me. I felt trapped living with these strangers, and I wanted out, yet I was afraid to leave because I'd had no experience in independence. I remember the intense joy I felt in those glorious early fall days on the high Laramie plains, the sky clear, the air crisp, a joy that has since become more measured, and I sorrow over it, less passionate. I could smell the seasons then, and the smells intoxicated me. The great guys in my sophomore class soon made themselves known, and I thought, yes, I will become one of them. They were the football guys, the guys popular with the girls, the ones who ran things. The great guys were the ones who wore the best clothes, letter sweaters and cords faded white rolled up halfway to the knees. They wore their hair in a crew cut. I was greeted on the second day of school by a couple of the great guys, friendly guys who laughed at whatever I said. I felt proud, heady, important. The great guys wanted to meet me after school, walk home with me, get to know me. And that day after school, sure enough, two of them were waiting for me. And they did walk home with me. And when we got to my house, one of them asked, "Is that where you live?" "Yeah," I said. "Oh," the other great guy said. Then the two of them turned and walked away. Several days later, I found out what had caused the deterioration of my social standing. "Is it true that you live in a chicken house?" somebody asked me. "The hell I do," I said, proud and haughty. Then somebody else who knew a little Laramie history explained it. I lived in a house that had been added on to. Best house my father could afford, a gray stucco 3-bedroom affair. It had space in back for chickens and hutches for some rabbits I raised, butchered and sold. There was a garden, too, and a small barn. Yet I found out that our house had started as a chicken house, all right, and somebody knew that, and they spread the word. Spence lives in a chicken house. At Laramie High in 1943, you had to come from money or power. Your father had to be a businessman or a newspaper publisher. If not, you had to be a big-time personality boy or an athlete. I qualified for none of these. Well, I thought maybe I should try to become an athlete. I went out for football. Bad idea. Soon my body was mashed and squashed, reduced to a pulpy mess. I quit halfway through the season, and my father said, "If you quit, you have to get a job." I found work at Friday's Grocery across the street from the high school. In the years that followed, I worked at Garlett's Drug Store and Midwest Sporting Goods. I had money, enough to buy a pair of brown and white loafers, and so with my rolled-up cords, I looked like a great guy, even if I wasn't one. That's what fashion is about, looking like somebody you really aren't. At Laramie High, there was also a girl I shall call Judy, a freckle-faced Irish girl with a turned-up nose, a nice smile, and a happy personality. We went out one night in my father's '37 Ford, its fenders flapping like the wings of a wounded bird. After a movie, we found a dark spot on a country road to park. Nice kisses, none of those French kisses which, so far as Laramie High was concerned, had not yet been invented. And before I knew it, I'd lost my innocence right there in the back seat of the old '37 Ford. The next morning I held back coming down the stairs. My parents could surely tell from my face what I'd done. Finally, about noon, I mustered the courage to face the music. My father was there to meet me as I descended the stairway. He stopped me before I could reach the landing. I could see it in his face. I had seen it before. Drawn, his holding back the anger. "You should be proud of yourself," he said. My heart started to pound, and I got very lightheaded. "Why? What's the matter?" "Your mother is crying. You've almost killed her. She took the car to Sunday school this morning. She said some of the ladies were looking at the car when they came out of church, and they were snickering." Then he explained why. The condom I had thrown out of the back seat window the night before had stuck to the glass, and there it hung, the official flag of fornication. flying there for all the Sunday school ladies to see. It humiliated your mother to the point of dying, my father said. Hope you're real proud of yourself. The next summer I returned to the Lemke-Hermberg ranch, a regular hand. Now I drove a mower with a team of young, powerful broncs, and later I stacked hay. My skinny arms grew muscles, and the other signs of manhood began to appear, and I felt like a man because, by God, I worked with men, and sweat with men, and I could cuss like a man, and spit and swagger, and if you saw me about half a mile away, you would have thought I was a man. Now that I was a man, old Kelsey, one of the hands, invited me to go with him to Rawlins, which was a man's town. So on a Saturday night I rode with old Kelsey in the ancient yellow pickup to the cozy rooms, which old Kelsey called home. It was, of course, a walk-up whorehouse. We sat down in the dingy parlor and we waited. The furniture was that overstuffed, cheap plastic kind with holes burned in the arms. The floors were old, worn green linoleum. Pretty soon the girls came in, 3 of them all decked out in those short, sexy little things, sexier than in any of my fantasies. When they walked in, they strutted their stuff sort of like models on a stage, and they walked up to where I was sitting and called me Honey. I was singled out by a stringy blonde who led me down a narrow hall to a room. We sat side by side on a small bed that sagged in the middle and was covered with a worn pink chenille bedspread. I wondered if this was where she slept after all the men she had been with had finally gone home. It was $5 for what she called a short time. I gave her a 5, and when it was done I walked out into the night, leaving old Kelsey behind. I was drained, yet suddenly sane. This night I had lain with a whore. All I could think to do was to say a humble prayer. Oh, God, forgive me, and please may I not get the clap, and please may I not get the siff, and may my folks never find out. Amen. I never got into much trouble at Laramie High. Drugs in any form were unheard of there in the mid-1940s. Most of the great guys didn't drink or smoke. But we did the jitterbug at the school dances. I could dance about as well as anybody, better than most. Although I was devoid of athletic skill, I was still a champion show-off. I'd developed a peculiar combination of shyness and extroversion. Sometimes I was the funny guy who managed to fall just short of being funny, the cut-up who tried too hard, and who was often more obnoxious than amusing. But when you're not a great guy, your options are limited. You can fade into the woodwork, or you can be a smart-ass. The show-off part of me seemed endemic to my personality. In speech class, I loved to argue with our teacher, Velma Linford, a red-headed, busty woman, who was as intransigent as a buffalo bull. But I, too, would never give up the argument. Finally, one day, I wore her down. "You get out of here," she hollered. "I'm kicking you out of this class." "How do you want me to go?" I asked with a smirk. "Any way you want. Just get out of here." I got up from my desk, walked to the window, opened it, and crawled out. Miss Linford, who was fond of me, had no sooner kicked me out than she began to miss me, and within the week I was back at my desk. "You ought to be a lawyer," she said once. I remembered that. I respected her spirit, her caring, and I felt loved by her. Of all of my teachers, she was perhaps the one most responsible for my early leaning toward the law. I was no natural scholar, but when my parents threatened that I couldn't go out unless my grades improved, I got straight A's. I liked literature. I liked drama. Drama fit my personality. I liked poetry, too, poetry about feelings and the magic of words and sounds. I hated math and I hated science. Figures had no personality. You couldn't feel figures. I had grown up to understand from my earliest days that high school was merely the beginning of the educational process. Spences went to college, but I had to decide what I was going to study before I went to the university, so as not to waste a lot of life meandering around the university's educational smorgasbord. By my senior year, I had resolved that I should become a lawyer. I had never known a lawyer, never met one, never saw one. I'd never been in a courtroom. I had no idea what lawyers did, but Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, and he'd become president, and so was Jefferson and Madison, and I thought Roosevelt was probably a lawyer, too. All great men were lawyers. I walked up to the law school one day on the University of Wyoming campus. The law school was fully contained in the upstairs of the old library building. I found the dean sitting in the outer office. "Who you looking for, son?" "Dean Hamilton," I said. "I'm Dean Hamilton," he said. "What can I do for you?" He got up and shook my hand like he was pumping water. He was a tall, straight man, bald as a hen's egg. He gave me a smile like they were free and told me to sit down. "I think I'd like to be a lawyer," I said. "Well, now, isn't that fine?" he replied. "Why?" "I don't know," I said. "Figured I'd be good at it." "That's as good a reason as any," he replied. The entire law school occupied only 3 classrooms, and the faculty was composed of 4 professors, including the dean. 20 or 30 kids usually started each fall, about half of whom flunked out the first quarter. The dean told me if I wanted, I could take an aptitude test to see if I was mentally and psychologically suited for the profession. I said, okay. I saw through the test right away and answered every question consistent with what I believed were the characteristics of a lawyer. The dean retrieved my test paper and in a few minutes was back. He seemed very excited, and he had a glorious smile on his face. "You've just earned the highest score on this aptitude test I have ever witnessed in all of my days as dean. Congratulations, son. You're going to become a very great lawyer." "Thank you," I said. "I'll see you in a couple of years," the dean hollered after me as I strutted out of the law library and into my life. Yes, law, whatever it was, however you did it, however you got to the top of it, well, that was for me. I was going to be a lawyer. A great lawyer, by God, the greatest.